Inside Crime is brought to you by Deterra. The Deterra drug deactivation system helps stop opioid misuse before it starts. With Deterra, unused prescription opioids and other drugs are gone for good. I'm Angeline Hartman. I've spent my career as a journalist covering some of the worst crimes in history. My craft is storytelling. My passion is crime fighting. Now I'm bringing you more stories, candid conversations with crime victims, their families, and law enforcement. We'll journey together as we learn what happens inside crime. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inside Crime. Our guest today has a unique job in law enforcement. She hopes this podcast will help save lives, and you can make a difference by sharing the information she'll talk about. My friend, Trebor Randle, is the special agent in charge of the Child Fatality Review Unit at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the GBI. It's her job to help make sure that every unexpected death of a child is investigated thoroughly. As part of her job, she visits the morgue. She sees dead bodies, including dead babies. While that's difficult to imagine, what's worse is this. Special Agent Randle says she sees an average of 3 babies a week whose deaths did not have to happen. That's 3 babies a week whose deaths could have been prevented if only their parent or caregiver understood the information you will hear today. As an investigator with more than 25 years of experience with the GBI, Agent Randle has practically seen it all. So in addition to hearing more about her program, we will get the inside story on one of her most memorable investigations. Here's a clip about that case from the TV show Snapped.
From the moment they first got together, Jason introduced Donna to a world of passion she'd never known. But the heat and tension really spiked when the couple found themselves embroiled in a shocking crime.
They saw a man who was beaten and had hate words written on his back.
The investigation into the crime would shine an uncomfortable spotlight on the couple's seemingly perfect romance.
They find all these love letters between Jason and Michael where they're professing their love for one another.
And expose a possible conspiracy so nefarious and unsettling, it would leave investigators reeling.
Welcome to Inside Crime, Trebor Randle.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This is very exciting to have you on the show.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about, got a lot to offer, a lot of thoughts, a lot of things I would like to chat about.
You have a lot to say is what you're telling me?
I've got a lot to say. It's what, it's our craft. It's what we do. We love it. And it's not every day you really get to talk about it in this type of forum or any forum. You don't want to talk about it at the dinner table,
Yes. Well, we're excited to have you on the show. And just to start out, let's give people a little bit of your background, and then we'll talk about a case of yours.
Well, I've basically been in law enforcement for my entire career, going on about 26 years now. So I'm a cop's cop, as they say. I do a lot of work with social workers and public health now in the field with child death that we work in. But I tell them all the time, I'm just the cop in the room. All of my experience, all of my knowledge, all of my training comes from working criminal cases.
And have you always been with GBI?
I have been with GBI for 25 of my 26-year law enforcement career. Prior to joining GBI, I was a deputy in a small town in southwest Georgia, about 5 feet tall, carrying a .357 Magnum revolver. It was quite a sight to see. But I knew then that this is what I wanted to do. But there was so much more to offer, as far as as opposed to riding around in a patrol car, which there's nothing wrong with that. They certainly are our heroes. I felt like I belonged in the segment of law enforcement that allowed you to put pieces of a puzzle together and follow cookie crumbs and get inside of folks' heads to try to figure out why they did what they did. And most importantly is to be able to bring some kind of closure to the families, bring justice, to the families and the victims. My heart is with women and children and the elderly. So crimes against women, crimes against children, crimes against the elderly, domestic violence, those things are my specialty and where my heart is, where my passion is.
Well, and now your specialty is with the Child Fatality Review Program, right?
That's correct. So
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I want to make sure everybody understands this important program.
So every state has a child fatality review process. All 50 states have a process for child death review. What's so unique about Georgia is the process for child death review falls within a state police agency, the GBI. I mean, it's legislatively mandated that we have this function on behalf of the governor and the children of Georgia. So my days are filled 365 days a year. They're filled with issues concerning and surrounding the deaths of children ages 0 to 17.
You must get this all the time, that must be such difficult work.
A lot of people ask me, how do you go to work every day? This is depressing. And you mean, no, you don't actually see dead kids, do you? And I said, well, that's kind of what I do. If a child dies in Georgia, we're going to see the file. We're going to touch it. I may even go down to the morgue if it's an interesting case. Or when I say an interesting case, something other than, a child was sick or run over and hit by a car, all unfortunate. But if there are unusual circumstances, suspicious circumstances, I want to get a real time, beat on what's going on. Do we have other children who could possibly be in danger? And then coordinate all the functions of law enforcement, prosecutors, DFACs to make sure we're doing everything we can for that child. We're their voice. So although some people look at it as being depressing, I come in here every day with that passion that we speak for that child. And although that child in the morgue does not have a voice, we're the voice, and we owe it to them to make sure whatever happened doesn't happen to another child or another family.
It's just that simple. When we say Child Fatality Review Program, it is your job to review what has happened and make sure everything is the way it should be.
That everything starts from the time that we get a call from a coroner saying we have a child that's died, wherever it is in 159 counties. The clock starts ticking. So that's the advantage of my law enforcement background, being in charge of this program for the whole state, is I have that investigative experience. So you may have a metro city, such as Atlanta, APD, they know what to happen. They have plenty of resources. They know what to do, rather. They have plenty of resources. But you may have some lower lying areas that don't have many resources, and they may only get a child death once a year. So that's when I jump in there and make sure they know what the protocol is and kind of walk them through the steps they should be taking as a result of the child's death and protecting other kids. So it's real time. And in the past, it wasn't real time, but now I'm involved in all of these cases day to day to make sure they're being adequately investigated, if prosecution is necessary, and that protocol is being followed, and to give that investigative assistance, and also train law enforcement throughout the state on how to handle these cases.
It's amazing, amazing work. Does it ever get to be too much for you, Trebor?
We want people to understand that although they see us, the boys and girls in blue, we come running in. Yes, that's our job. You run towards chaos, towards the sound of the bullets. You see the blood and guts, and it's our job to put the pieces together. We are human. Sometimes I come in this morgue and there's a particular case that bothers me, but what it does is fuel my fire. That's what it does. It doesn't make me want to quit. It doesn't make me want to say this is too much. But if anybody tells you that it doesn't bother them anymore, I've been doing this 26 years. Yeah, it bothers you. It bothers you. We
Mhm.
become desensitized to somewhat, but you turn around and you use that. The average citizen wouldn't be able to, go home and go to bed tonight after seeing what I saw, but we become desensitized to that part of it, but we turn around and use it as fuel. I just think it's some type of God-given gift that everybody doesn't have.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I often get the same question, obviously on a different scale, but get similar questions. As a reporter, as a journalist, I see a lot too, and am exposed to different things. And some of the hardest things are talking to family members of crime victims and having that intimacy with them, because it is a very intimate thing when you are talking to them about their story and what the impact the crime has had on them.
It is, and it's
Um,
a balance. It's a balance because you have to have some empathy. I feel like if I don't sit across from or talk to a mom frequently, I have to call and talk with mothers whose kids have committed suicide, or women who have accidentally rolled over on their infants as part of a campaign we have to get people to stop co-sleeping with their babies. But that's another story. But you have to have some empathy. I think that as a good, law enforcement officer, investigator, detective, whatever you want to call it, you use some of that. That gives you, that get up and go to actually bring justice to the situation, bring them closure. So you do have to have a balance, and you can get pulled in to a particularly tragic story. And I think that human side of us, it definitely helps because we have families, whether you have kids of your own or not, you have nieces and nephews. So I think we can always put ourselves in someone else's shoes.
yeah. I'm not going to let that go, Trevor. You just mentioned briefly about co-sleeping, and I think we should talk about it before we forget, because it is important. It's important to take the opportunity right now to let people know, what is it you want to tell people, because I think you know better than anybody else, it still happens and people don't know.
I can tell you that, one, I appreciate the opportunity because knowledge is power. The only way we change our behavior is by educating ourselves. So I don't miss any opportunity to educate the public to say that the number one cause of preventable deaths of our babies, number one, is due to unsafe sleep.
And what does that mean? Unsafe sleep. Give us an example.
We like to refer to it as the opposite of the ABCs of safe sleep. So I'll give you the ABCs of safe sleep: alone, on their back, and in a crib. So what that means is if you see a blank canvas of a baby's crib with nothing but a sheet in it, looks kind of boring, no bumpers, no blankets, no stuffed animals, all these products that you see at the different retailers, that's exactly what safe sleep is. So if you're doing anything that's the opposite of the ABCs, that is unsafe sleep. If you cover your infant up with a blanket, that can be deadly. If you put stuffed animals inside the crib, that can be deadly. If you have bumper pads in the crib with the baby, that can be deadly. So
Why can it be deadly?
what
Break it down for
what
us.
what we're seeing is very simple. It's not, hard to explain. When people say, "Well, I thought that, a child would automatically know." What I'm telling you is that we know that infants, especially between the ages of 0 to 5 months, are at higher risk for suffocation, okay? They don't have the development many times in their neck muscles. Their brains are not developed enough to say, "Hey, you need to breathe. Take a breath." Their face or their mouth may be blocked by a blanket or a pillow or a stuffed animal. They just can't do it on their own. So what happens is they suffocate, and this was known in years past as crib death. We know now that SIDS is very rare. A lot of people still refer to it as SIDS, but I'll just give you an example. When I looked at all of my death data for 2016, of every infant that had passed away in their sleep, for example. Only 2 cases of over 150 were ruled as SIDS. The underlying factor in the other 150 some odd cases was unsafe sleep environment. So, in addition to the things I just mentioned to you, take the baby out of the crib and put the baby in an adult bed, which a lot of people do. So they asked me, well, are you going to feel judgy, or, are you going to, kind of tick people off about telling them you shouldn't put the infant in the bed?
Because let's just be, honestly, that's what women want to do. They're tired. They want to breastfeed their baby. They want to be comfortable. They want the baby to go to sleep. They put the baby right next to them and fall asleep while breastfeeding often.
Absolutely. And what I will tell them is that every time I go in the morgue, 3 days a week, I am averaging in the state of Georgia alone 3 infants a week that are in my morgue due to unsafe sleep. Now, I will tell you that you won't find anybody that knew that before they hear this, unless they're in my field. Before I came to this line of work, just as an investigator, I had no idea because we didn't get called into work those cases where there weren't suspicious circumstances. So
Hmm.
now, what I tell individuals, and whether I'm, being quoted by the newspaper or we're actually being featured somewhere on the news, we're going to be bold enough to say, I know it's risky. I did it. I'm guilty. My daughter is 21 years old. Thankfully, she survived it. But I can tell you that you're putting your infant at a higher risk of fatality if you do these things we're telling you not to do. I have had babies come in who were suffocated by their mother's breast. I've had babies come in who fell asleep on dad's chest on the couch and they suffocated. I've had babies who were sleeping with mom or dad on the couch, cradled in their arm, and they rolled off the couch onto a blanket, onto a pillow. These are things that you're not going to hear about because they're not going to be in the news, but it is the sad reality. And when I tell you the parents and the guilt they feel knowing that they contributed to their child's death, we know it was accidental, they can barely live with themselves. So, what's at stake? What is the risk here? The
Yeah.
risk is too great. So that's why I'm telling the parents, do not do it. Educate your babysitters, grandma and grandpa. When you send the baby over to stay the night over, send a pack and play, send a portable bassinet. They have to have their own isolette to sleep in. The adult bed is the most dangerous place for an infant. And if you don't believe me, set up a recorder when you go to sleep at night. And even though you go to sleep in the same spot, you wake up there. If you've ever had a sleep study done, in the sleep lab, people
Yes.
will tell you, oh my gosh, I had no idea I moved that much. You move, pillows move, blankets
Right.
move. And sometimes we can't convince them that they rolled over on their child. I can remember a case, now that you've gotten me started, where the only indication the father had that the baby had rolled, because obviously we're adults, so we're heavier, right? Well, what happens when you have that little indentation in the mattress, unless you got a gazillion-dollar purple mattress or something that doesn't move? Well, the baby will kind of sink in. And then once they start scooting, what do? They kind of scoot into that warm space. You don't know that that's happening when you sleep. I can almost guarantee you. So this family never would have believed that's what happened until dad was walking around the house while the crime scene was being documented, and someone that was very astute, a young investigator, saw something on the back of his t-shirt. And you know what it was? It's what we
Huh.
call purge. And that's after the child is deceased. This is going to be the froth, the foam, the mucus that comes out of his nose. That's the only way we were able to convince that parent that that was the child's finally resting place, up against his back. Now, do you know what that did to him? Just knowing that making a decision not to put that infant in the bed could have saved his child's life.
Oh, gosh. Trevor, that is a heartbreaking story. Um, let's please review the ABCs that you mentioned earlier.
The ABCs of safe sleep. The child should be A, alone, B, put to sleep on their back, not their stomach, and C, in a crib. So that means not the adult bed, not an air mattress, not the sofa, not the car seat. They are very deadly for an infant who can slip down a little bit and it'll pinch off their airway if they're sleeping for too long in a car seat, alone, on their back, and in a crib.
You know what, Trevor? We're going to have more information on our website for people who want to know more about this
Thank you.
because, yeah, it is important information. And I think people just take it for granted, and people are so busy, being new parents, and there's so much information to take in. A lot of times they just don't know. And you're right. The information doesn't get out there because there are stories that don't make the news.
These stories never make the news. I can assure you of that. So I appreciate you so much for even offering to put this information on the website about safe sleep.
Thank you. You are changing the culture of how we do things. And that's not easy.
Thank you.
Trebor, let's talk about stories that do make the news because I think you have a few. So let's talk about, when we're talking about 26 years in law enforcement, I'm sure you have many, many cases that are memorable. It's hard to pick, I'm sure, just one. But what's at the top of your list in terms of memorable cases that you think our listeners might want to hear, that you can talk about the backstory, stuff that did not make the news?
There are always cases that stand out in your mind, for various reasons. One of the more intricate cases in terms of the details and the levels that the suspect went to avoid detection comes to mind was a case that involved a love triangle, we call it, in the small town of Mock, Georgia, which is right outside of Buena Vista, Georgia.
Let's tell us how far outside of Atlanta and give us a little locator there.
Okay. Mock, Georgia is a small town outside of Columbus, Georgia, would be the next larger city, about 2 hours south of Atlanta.
Got it.
It's Marion County, Georgia. The main little town there is Buena Vista. It's one of those one light towns, as we say, a one traffic light town, very rural area. Working as the assistant special agent in charge in the Americus, Georgia field office, we were responsible for 9 counties. And when you work these areas that have a lot of rural areas, smaller departments, as I mentioned earlier, they don't necessarily have the resources, some of the expertise necessary to work what we call a whodunit homicide, meaning you have no leads, no witnesses, you just have a body.
Mm-hmm.
And this was literally one of those cases.
Well, so how did it come to you guys?
So we got a call from the local sheriff into our office there, our regional office in Americus, stating that they had found a white female deceased on the side of the road as some children on a school bus, unfortunately, were passing by. And they told the bus driver, there's a lady in the ditch. Well, kids being kids, and bus
Hang on. The kids are in the school bus and they see a woman in the ditch?
The kids are on the school bus, unfortunately, and they tell the bus driver, we saw a lady in a ditch back there. And of course, he doesn't believe them because they're kids. And he's like, surely you're pulling my leg. And they carried on so bad about it, the bus driver turned around, circled back because the kids were so passionate about what they saw. Again, small town Georgia, this just doesn't happen, right? So he goes back, and sure enough, he sees the body in the ditch. They call the sheriff, and that's kind of how things get rolling.
My goodness. Okay. So now you guys are out there.
We respond to the scene. It turns out we don't have a female in a ditch. It's actually a male that had lengthy hair. So from the beginning, this case got really wild based on the fact that there were some interesting markings on the individual's body. There was a marking of KKK on the young man's body. There were derogatory terms written on his body, such as faggot, things of that nature. So immediately, what do you assume we have here?
Right, a hate crime. But what do you mean written? I
So
mean,
these markings were written. These markings were made by black magic marker, like a black Sharpie marker, where somebody
okay.
was written on his body. And of course, we say, well, this has the markings of a hate crime based on what we have, because we don't have anything. This person is unidentified. Right now, he's a John Doe, but we know that we have these markings. So we sound the alarm, because that's the last thing we want in small town Georgia, is to find out we have a hate crime here. So we don't know necessarily how the individual died as of yet. We haven't had the autopsy. We see some weird injuries about the head or face. And we don't know how long the body's been out there. We process the crime scene. It's clear to us that this body has been dumped. So we know we have a crime scene somewhere, a secondary crime scene. The positioning of the body was a little odd, meaning that the person almost looked like they were balled up in the fetal position, but they were face down. So that was of significance later on during the investigation. So the first thing you always do, we fan out a rural area, but we're going to knock on doors for the closest houses, farms, things of that nature. Anybody who may have routinely driven that road on the way to work. And we really don't get much. We really don't get much at first. So we're at a loss. We send the body to the crime lab in Atlanta, or GBI crime lab at headquarters, to do an autopsy and say, hey, guys, give us something. What do we have? Where do we start? Because there are no witnesses. So when you talk about a whodunit homicide, you got a John Doe. So what do? You start with a sketch. We get our sketch artist to do a sketch. We put this out all over the media. We get nothing. So while we're waiting on the autopsy to be completed, we get a call maybe the next day, not the same day. We get a call. We're about 24 hours in. They do tell us at autopsy this young man has a rod in his leg. So we're working frantically around the clock, no sleep, to try to identify our victim, because they do have serial numbers, but we haven't gotten that information back. Again, nobody knows this kid. I say kid, young man. Nobody knows him. Nobody recognizes him. And it later turns out that he was not from this area. So what ends up happening is we get a phone call into the office from someone who saw the news. And this phone call was very interesting, to say the least, and ended up being very valuable to our investigation. We get a call from an individual who says, I think that might be our roommate. And his name is Michael. Well, why do you think it might be your
Why do you
roommate?
think he might be your roommate?
Well, we live in Marion County, and we think that our roommate has been living a very, risky lifestyle lately. Sometimes he goes away for days at a time. We've been really concerned about his behavior, and we haven't seen him for a few days, and we think that could be him. So,
Okay.
okay, where do you live in Marion County? We live in Malk, Georgia. We get the information. I get that information, and something about it just isn't right. Something about it, out of all the calls we get, it just sticks in my craw. So
Right from the beginning.
from the beginning, and you've heard that before, right?
Well,
Your spidey senses, right? There's something to that. I'm telling you, all cops are part spider somewhere. But
yeah.
we go out. We send some agents out to the house, and they get there. There's a young white female. This victim was a young white male. There's a young white female who is handicapped. There's a black male who is also quote unquote handicapped, who's seated in a wheelchair, invites them in and says, well, we think it could be our roommate. Well, why do you think it could be your roommate? And then they go through the story about his risky lifestyle and behavior. And, we think that he's probably using drugs, things of this nature. And he meets these guys on the internet, and he's going out probably having sex for money, we think also.
Inside Crime is brought to you by Deterra. The Deterra drug deactivation system is an independently tested, safe, and environmentally sound solution that permanently deactivates, destroys, and disposes of unneeded pills, patches, liquids, creams, and films right at home. Be part of the solution to reduce drug abuse. Learn more at deterrasystem.com.
Well, we think it could be our roommate. Well, why do you think it could be your roommate? And then they go through the story about his risky lifestyle and behavior. And, we think that he's probably using drugs, things of this nature. And he meets these guys on the internet, and he's going out probably having sex for money, we think also.
So just to clarify, you have two people who live in a home and they say their roommate is missing. They're worried about his risky behavior. They think he's meeting people online and maybe meeting people in person now. Is that right?
That's correct.
So what happens?
So we decide that we would go ahead and start collecting evidence at the house because we have a John Doe. So the first thing you need to do is say, well, show us his room so we can start collecting, toothbrush, hairbrush, anything that would give us a DNA sample so we can try and positively identify him. Again, remember that I told you there was no identification on Michael when his body was found.
Okay.
Which would later be important in the investigation. So we moved through the house throughout the night. The house was pretty interesting. Just some weird things. We've got mice. We've got
What does that mean, interesting?
Just you see everything, on these crime scenes. They're just when you think you've seen it all and heard it all. You've talked with other law enforcement officers throughout your years of the things that we come across. But again, the suspect in this case, whose name ended up being Jason Slaughter, he was seated in a wheelchair. His wife, Donna Slaughter, was a white female who had cerebral palsy. So she had the two canes attached to her wrist. They look pretty harmless, right?
So Jason's in the wheelchair and Donna's in the wheelchair.
Donna's not in a wheelchair, but she gets around utilizing these two canes that are attached to her wrist. So the first thing we encounter is two very large pit bulls. They were her babies. So that was a little interesting. We asked them to put the dogs away in the room. So they loved animals, apparently. They had a little mouse. I believe maybe his name was Mr. Bubbles or something like that. That was kind of interesting.
Mr. Bubbles?
Something like that, if I remember correctly. And then there was a snake in one of the bedrooms, along with some other little rodents, if I recall. It's just getting kind of weird, if you know what I mean. We're just kind of scratching our heads. So we go into Michael's room, and the agents are processing things for evidence, as I mentioned. There's a lot of weapons in the house, we notice, and quickly, the agents start doing their background on the individuals, and we find out that Jason is a convicted felon. So that's problematic for Jason. He's probably going to end up going to jail because he's not supposed to be in possession of these weapons. So again, we listen to their elaborate story about their roommate, collect all these items of evidence to be able to start trying to identify who Michael was. And the days leading into the investigation, we were able to get a match on the serial number for the rod that was in his leg, driver's license photos and things of that nature. So we're really comfortable that this is the roommate. One of the things that the agents called me about that they thought was weird, we're looking over the grounds. There was a red pickup truck that was not hidden, but you can tell someone was trying to make sure it was kind of secluded and out of the way. You would not know that they had a vehicle if you just drove up to the property, which we did not. And the way that the vehicle was situated on the property next to this structure, I don't know if you would call it maybe a shed, but an outbuilding, somebody had gone through great lengths to make sure they tucked that vehicle away. Just again, your spidey senses saying, something's not quite right here. The
Okay.
driver's side door was jammed up against, pretty close up against the structure. So you would have had to crawl out of the passenger side.
Mm-hmm.
The agents call me on the phone about this discovery. And I remember telling them, stop what you're doing, pump the brakes. We need to get a search warrant. Because when something's off like that, along with the phone call, if something's just telling you something's not right, it probably isn't. So you want to move into the mode of a search warrant in the event that the people who gave you consent to search their property turns out to be your suspects. We don't want any issues when it comes time for court. So we asked them for an explanation. They said somebody was measuring because they were thinking about putting an awning over the truck. Didn't sound quite right. Again, all of the agents have fanned out. They're canvassing. They did find an individual who said they thought they saw a red pickup truck in the area where the body was dumped that morning. They take Mr. Slaughter to the sheriff's office because, of course, there's the issue of these guns, and nothing about what they're saying is adding up. I develop a relationship pretty quickly with Donna Slaughter, who is the wife. And it becomes apparent to me that Donna, who met her husband through an exchange program in Seattle, maybe 10 years sooner, kept in touch with him. She actually is from the UK. She kept in touch with him online, and eventually he convinced her to move to Delaware. They got married. Um, Jason Slaughter had already started a friendship with Michael Hagley. We would later find out that Jason and Michael were romantically involved. And Donna was just very protective of her husband, very protective. You could tell that whatever may have gone on, she was not the mastermind. She was somebody who was easily manipulated. Um, I spent probably in excess of 12 hours with this young lady. Now, you hear of detectives doing interviews. You got to take your time, you develop a rapport. But when I tell you over a series of days, the amount of time that I spent with this young lady, again, just having some amount of compassion for her, being from the UK, I felt that she had been alienated. She didn't have any friends in Georgia. I would later find out from talking with her that her husband, Jason, was very controlling. And when they got him to come to the sheriff's office, asked him to come to the sheriff's office, and they helped him out of his wheelchair, what was significant is that he had been sitting on her passport. Again, didn't
In the
mean anything.
wheelchair?
He had been sitting on her passport. His wife's passport was underneath him in a wheelchair. Now, we would later find out that Jason was very capable of walking. Again, this individual from early on thought that he could outsmart law enforcement. Turns out he had previously been a criminal justice major, and he thought he knew everything about the law. Donna's passport was underneath him. As I spent days with Donna, sometimes she would be sitting in my car. We would be talking, interviewing her for hours and finding out that she was a victim of domestic violence from a previous relationship in the UK. She felt worthless, that she had no value to anybody. Jason was very controlling of her. She wasn't allowed to make contact with her family back home. She wasn't allowed to visit anybody. And then we would find out Jason was the same way with Michael. So things start to quickly unfold that something else is going on here.
Let me just make sure I have this right. So Donna is from the UK. Donna is married to Jason, right? And
Correct.
before this, they used to live in Delaware together.
Yes.
So Jason and Donna live in Delaware and at some point moved to Mock, Georgia.
With Michael. That's correct.
Okay. So they met Michael in Delaware?
Michael and Jason had already been friends before Donna came from the UK.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So, she explained it as just a friendship between the three of them. She told me very clearly that Michael was quote unquote gay, but Jason was not. And it was very clear that she was in denial about her own husband.
Okay, I forgot we started out by saying this is a love triangle. So this is Jason is married to Donna. He has a wife, but it sounds like he has a lover in Michael, but the Donna, the wife, does not realize it. And they all three live together in Mock, Georgia,
They all
correct?
three lived together. According to Donna, Jason had researched this property online and decided that they would all buy it. And they moved from Delaware to the middle of nowhere, which I think was significant. Um, I felt that after learning more about Jason and watching his behavior and listening to him, he was very charismatic. Donna was very much in love with her husband. She felt like he was the only person in the world who cared about her, but we found out that he treated her very poorly. So, as the case is progressing, there's an autopsy done. We know that there's some type of injury to Michael's face, but there's another twist. We can't find what caused his death. So again, we're kind of working in the blind. I asked Donna if she would take a polygraph. We're about 5 days in. I have a relationship with her. At this point, her husband has stopped communicating with law enforcement. He's demanding lawyers. He's at the jail in Marion County, acting a fool. Says that he's having seizures. He's a medical patient. Until, of course, the sheriff walks in and catches him standing on top of his bed. Now they know he can walk. So then we do our homework and we start researching places they had gone. The library in Columbus. I probably sat through 8 hours of surveillance footage until we found videos of them as a group coming to the library, everybody walking in, especially Jason, very able-bodied, and walking
Oh
out of
my
the library. So
goodness.
now we know this is all just his ruse to say, hey, I'm feeble. I have problems with my legs. It's neurological. He's dragging himself around the jail, crawling, if you will, very animated. But like I said, the sheriff was able to blow that out of the water when they caught him standing up on his bed trying to whisper to his wife in the other cell from his
Oh
cell. And
my
we can't make
goodness.
this up. So we know he's able-bodied. So we asked Donna to take a polygraph, and Donna confesses that she has murdered Michael. Nobody believes Donna. You have to understand, this young lady is about 90 pounds soaking wet. They're all young 20s, early 20s. She looks pretty pitiful, as you'll see from the photograph. She just does not look like she could hurt, a hair on anyone's head. Donna explained to me during the ride home that she did not want me to think that she was a bad person. She had wanted to tell me the truth because I was her only friend. Um, I asked Donna if she would be willing to show me what happened. And within the next 24 hours, she actually walks me through what occurred. And she explains to me that she used a revolver handgun. She loaded it with one bullet and she snuck up behind her husband and the victim on the sofa. She placed the gun to the back of his head and she fired one shot. Now, again, this is a learning lesson, a teaching lesson for law enforcement. When you kind of get that tunnel vision that there's no way she could have done this. She probably couldn't even pull the trigger on this gun. How does she even know how to operate a gun? Well, me being a girl cop, I take exception to that anyway, because some girls shoot better than guys. I
Right.
had to prove her story right. It was so important to her that I believe her because in her mind she felt like I was her only friend in the world. I actually took a revolver that of mine in the vehicle and asked her to demonstrate for me just so I could wrap my head around the fact that she knew how to operate a gun. She actually demonstrated. She knew how to, release the chamber, of the revolver. The cylinder fell out, and she showed me how she was able to handle this gun. She said, I've never fired one before, but this is what I did. And what she was demonstrating to me was pretty accurate. I asked her what she did with the gun. She said, we threw it away along with the container that we put his body in. Well, what container?
What
What do you
container?
mean? Turns out they had placed Michael's body in a Rubbermaid storage tote and discarded him like he was trash. So when I tell you it was significant how his body was positioned, kind of in a fetal position, face down,
Mm-hmm.
everything she's telling me, we're able to corroborate. And she says, please believe me. Please believe me. Now, again, we're everybody's like gunning for Jason because we can tell he's the shyster here, and there, it's like, maybe she's just trying to take the fall for this guy. So not only does she demonstrate how to operate a handgun, she says, I'll take you to the landfill where we dump these items. So when I tell you we've got agents everywhere, we've got anybody that we can get from the sheriff's office to volunteer to go dumpster diving with us. We say that not being facetious, literally, where we're dumpster diving, and we check any number of dumpsters, and the weapon was not there. So we never recovered the weapon in this case. As the days go by, I'm asking her, will you demonstrate for me how you killed Michael? And because I feel like a jury may not believe this, I told my staff, I told the agents, we're going to have to videotape this because there's no way that they're going to believe this. If I get on the stand and she's sitting there and I explain to them what she described for me. So fortunately, we actually videotaped it. And we don't necessarily do that in every case with every confession, but it became so important later when this case went to trial. She demonstrated for me how she walked out of the bedroom with a pile of clothing, folded laundry. She hid the gun in between some of the laundry. She walked up behind the couch. She got down on her knees, which would look like it was physically impossible for this young lady to do, but she was able to demonstrate this for me. She
Mm-hmm.
said, I put the gun to the base of his head and I pulled the trigger. Now, because Michael Hagley was a John Doe, he fortunately was still at the crime lab. We still had his body at the medical examiner's office. When I tell you, I got on the phone, called to the highest level through our rank structure up to the inspector and said, I need you to have the doctor pull the body back out. Now,
Mm-hmm.
talk about, taking a stand. This is another teaching moment for investigators. Whether you're the newest detective or investigator on the force or you've been there 26 years, stand your ground. My inspector's retired now, so I don't mind telling you that my inspector thought that I was crazy. He said, do you mean to tell me this doctor spent hours and hours with this young man examining his body? It was thorough, it was complete. He did not find a bullet hole. And you're telling me that she said she shot him and that's what we're looking for? I said, I mean to tell you they need to pull him out again and take one last look. And it made such a ruckus that some of the higher ups wanted to walk over and actually watch the doctor pull our victim back out of the cooler, take his skull off, re-examine it, and it turns out there was this little tiny hole at the base of his skull. It never perforated his skull. It traveled under the skin of the scalp and it exited through his eye, hence the injury that I told you to his face that would prove to be significant. We
Oh
didn't
my
know if he had been
gosh.
hit with an ice
Oh.
pick. It was
So,
just, this was such a puzzling case. And I mean to tell you, she felt so relieved at that moment when I told her, they found it. You're telling me the truth. And I was relieved too, because by now I'm thinking I'm going to be transferred to the Florida state line for questioning my doctor.
oh, man. So she did it on her own? So Jason had nothing to do with it?
Well, that's the other part of it. So this is the confession. This is the confession, right? So where things start unraveling really, really quickly. And of course, she goes to show me how she pushes him forward so that he wouldn't bleed on the couch. And then her husband, she says that he's surprised. But again, we feel like this was all orchestrated by him, although we never got that confession from her. We were able to show that he helped dispose of the body because that she could not do by herself physically. Obviously, he had been lying to us the whole time. And then we found the smoking gun, which is a life insurance policy that was in excess of $200,000. I'm almost certain, in excess of $250,000, $250,000 worth of life insurance in the name of who else? Jason Slaughter is the beneficiary.
So
And this
Jason was the beneficiary. He took out an insurance policy.
absolutely on Michael.
Well,
And so guess what? The explanation from her is, Donna, why this life insurance? Jason wanted him dead so he could collect his money. She said, well, they had policies on each other. Well, it turns out the policy that was on Jason that Michael owned was something insignificant, maybe like $20,000. So Jason didn't plan on dying anytime soon, if you understand what I mean.
yes.
So where that, in all seriousness, where that becomes important, we get a call from Delaware, and it turns out law enforcement up there had been investigating Jason Slaughter for insurance schemes and scams he had been running. They felt that Jason had done something similar to where he had staged a home invasion robbery where his live-in gay lover was killed, and Jason received just a superficial shotgun wound to his shoulder. When I tell you that we just could not believe our ears what we had just heard, and they said, is it true that you guys are suspecting this guy in a homicide in Georgia? So what do you think happened next? Their investigators flew here, we flew up there to get all the details of the case, and that became very instrumental in the prosecution eventually, that Jason had attempted to do this before, but State Farm would not pay out because the death of his live-in gay lover at the time was still under investigation, and the police had not made an arrest. So
So
Jason did
is
not
the thought
receive the payout.
he did not receive the payout? And is the thought that he did not receive the payout and then they moved to Georgia? Is that
I think that
timeline?
what we put together, to prosecute Jason in this case is that this was his MO. We were able to track down another lover of his who said, when I dealt with him, he was very violent. He beat me, he abused me, he was very controlling, didn't let me call people. It was the same MO. We did insurance scams together. He was into forgery, all these different things. So Jason, he's a shyster. He's in it for the money, but he thinks he's smart and he knows how to quote unquote get away with murder. What the reason why this case was so memorable is that had they not made that phone call to my office, I am almost certain that this young man and his wife would have gotten away with murder. But in order to have an insurance claim, what do you need? You've got to be able to identify the victim.
body.
So I find out during the investigation that it was never intended for him to be a John Doe. Jason had put the ID of Michael Hagel in Michael's pocket, and apparently it fell out during transport. That's where things got interesting. They had to make the call to identify this individual.
Okay, so let's go back to be clear. Jason and Donna take the body, dump it, and the ID falls out, right? So now we have an unidentified body. So that's why a few days later, whenever it is, they call you guys and say, we think our roommate is missing.
Absolutely. You cannot have a payout on a life insurance policy on a
because otherwise it would just be like he's missing.
Absolutely. So when I tell you that this case is so the fact that we could have missed it. Nobody in Georgia knew who this young man was until
Right.
they called and put themselves smack dab in the middle of our investigation, and these things just kept unraveling. We started finding out more information about Jason's background. Jason was not a nice person. I still to this day, think about Donna often. Donna certainly knew what she was doing. I'm not so certain that she did not, quote unquote, try to take the fall for her husband, because he was certainly the mastermind in all of this, because he had done it before and he had gotten away with it. But I'm happy to report Delaware was able to use this case as a platform to prosecute him in Newcastle for what he had done to his previous roommate, and that was successful as well.
Great. So what was the final outcome out of all of this?
We were
He's
able to charge and indict Donna and Jason Slaughter with the murder of Michael Hagel, and the family was forever grateful. They came to Georgia to pick up Michael's remains, and they wanted to meet me in person because they felt that Michael's life mattered to us.
Trevor, I just want to ask, like, just to wrap up the details. So the markings on Michael's body, that was just to throw off the cops? That was
That was
just to throw off the
completely
investigation?
to send us down an entire another rabbit hole, and it almost worked, and they almost got away with murder. Donna did confess that they did take a Sharpie marker from the house to write those markings on his body so that we would think it was a hate crime.
This is a crazy story.
It was beyond crazy. There's so many just small intricacies that were involved with this young man just thinking, with the suspect, Jason, thinking he could outsmart law enforcement because he had taken some criminal justice courses. Although he did not pull the trigger, it was very obvious that he was part of this scheme to be able to profit off of Michael's death. And because he never confessed and he never taught with law enforcement anymore, we had to solely rely on Donna, who protected him to the very end. But it was very clear that if he did not agree, that she would pull the trigger because no one would ever convince her. He lived a lifestyle in front of her that would make her extremely jealous, make her feel worthless. She said Michael talked about the fact that she couldn't get pregnant and she couldn't have a baby, and that made her angry. Either way, we feel that Jason Slaughter orchestrated all of that. So it would either lead to Michael's death or he agreed that she would be the one to pull the trigger.
Hmm. And, when you talk about takeaways for this case, I mean, for me, just listening, you had a relationship with her. You formed a relationship with Donna.
Absolutely. It was apparent that this man had taken advantage of her. He preyed on individuals that had very low self-esteem, that didn't think much of themselves. Michael had some issues with that as well. He didn't think he was worthy of anybody's love. He made it to where they thought he was God. He was the only one that cared about them. He was the only one that could take care of them. He controlled the purse strings. He had a disability check. Nobody had any money. He was controlling everything. We found a recording later, which was very damning for Jason, that he's talking with Michael's spirit. And of course, this is before we found the body. So now we know that he knows that Michael is dead before we find the body, where he's talking to Michael's spirit and asking him for a sign because he misses him. So that was also evidence to their romantic relationship as well.
Trevor, please tell me about this recording. What are you talking about?
Well, the recording is
A cell
like I
phone
said,
recording?
it's weird. There was some weird stuff going on in the house. We found a recording, just a handheld recorder with some digital files where Jason Slaughter's alone, presumably, talking to Michael, who is deceased, we now know. And this was after they dumped the body. I don't know if this was maybe out of guilt, but he wants Michael to give him a sign somehow that he hears him. But he was professing his love for Michael and some other things. So that was part of the evidence that we found in the house. And like I said, every piece of that evidence became so very important in the successful prosecution of this case.
Well, that is a memorable one. I do
Certainly.
understand. I do understand why you brought this one up. That one is definitely one for the books, Trevor. I really appreciate you sharing your story and your message earlier regarding the Child Fatality Review Program. A lot of important stuff we talked about today. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for being willing to bring these stories to that special audience that enjoy going inside crime. I think is great what you're doing, and I wish you success. I've thoroughly enjoyed all of the episodes so far, and I look forward to coming back again.
Yes, we will definitely have you back. Thank you so much. Good luck to you, Trebor. Hang in there.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of Inside Crime. I hope you enjoyed our show, and I hope you will share the information that Miss Trebor Randle first talked about. If you know a parent or caregiver of a baby, please share with them the ABCs of safe sleep. To learn more about how to keep babies safe, go to our website, insidecrime.com. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm your host, Angeline Hartman. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode of Inside Crime.